Hello humans! Today I wanted to talk about these guys right here. So these are my Buck 110s. The Buck 110 short is having a bit of a moment lately, so I figured I would do an actual serious video, get in depth, and talk a little bit about the Buck 110 Folding Hunter, absolute classic of a knife. So I do not have a new Buck 110 by any stretch of the imagination. I have two relatively older Buck 110s. If you want to know how to date your Buck 110, you can go on the Buck website, and they actually break down what the date stamps are and all of that. So this one right here is from 1991. You can see, if I can get past the glare there, you can see the plus symbol next to the 110. That indicates that this particular example is from 1991. And on this older example, we have the two dots next to, oh, if it just wants to focus, it'd be really nice. We have two dots next to the 110 designation, which marks this as having been made between 1974 and 1980. After 1980, before 1986, they had two dots on one side and one dot on the other. There's a whole history there. But, point being, I can date these fairly well, not super accurately. Like I said, this one here I can only get to within a 6-year window. But these are both older examples, sufficing to say. Okay? Good. This Buck 110 has been heavily used. You can see it's been hammered on quite a bit. And there's just a little bit of blade play in the locked out position, and it's a little bit floppy. This is not an issue of like this being a knockoff or anything like that. This is an authentic Buck. What this is old and heavily used. As parts start to wear, they start to get a little bit looser. There starts to be a little bit more play. The main pin that holds the blade in place is only brass. Brass is a very soft material, which does actually mean it can get dented, bent out much easier than other things. This older example has just faced a lot less use, and it is actually in really good shape. I picked it up with its sheath, and it does not have a lot of those same marks of use. This is much less used than my older example, which is actually why I use it for my size comparisons, because the tip on this one here and the whole blade has actually been used quite a bit. You can see it has been notably shrunk. At some point, somebody broke the tip off this and they reprofiled it, and you ended up with just a much shorter blade. So this is a smaller knife, but that's just because it has been used and sharpened, and you can feel the sharpening difference. Like, this is thicker behind the edge than this older version. Anyway, point being, super cool. So in terms of materials, we have ebony. Both of these are actually from before the Taylor's guitars. We're just going to do a lot of history on the Buck 110s right now, just for shits and giggles. So the Buck 110 obviously came into production in 1964. It was unquestionably the knife that popularized the lockback in the North American markets. In the European markets, you have much older knives with lockback models, in particular the Otter Messer K55K Black Cat, which is a steel folded construction. It's a very thin knife. It's not super heavy duty, but that would have been an early EDC style knife featuring a backlock out of Europe, and they'd had that for almost 100 years before the Buck 110 came into production. Even here in Canada, we actually have knives that predate the Buck 110, such as the Gromans backlock folders. So the backlock folder is not new to Buck. What Buck did is they made it, one, very reliable, and two, they made this into something you could actually take out hunting and consider to be a suitable hunting tool. That is Buck's big contribution to folding knives, and they popularized it as something you carried on your belt with a belt sheath, and they sell them still with these belt sheaths. You can actually see the model stamp on it. This is an older one. This one here came with my 70s era Buck, and they sold them, right? That is what they sold to people. That is what popularized the Buck 110 folder. Is not necessarily that it is like the first to have a lockback, or the one that perfected the lockback, or anything like that. What it is truly is the one that sold the idea of a folding knife to the American people. And they did that extremely well. This is a phenomenal knife, especially at the time. Like, there's nothing to compare this to, right? You would not see a pocket clip on a production folding knife until the Spyderco Worker, which I believe was the 80s. So like 20 years after this thing came out. Anyway, nerdy stuff aside, let's talk about the materials here. Both of these are actually ebony blades. They are older, so this is a much nicer piece of ebony than the 90s version. By the 90s, ebony had become a material that was being reduced. It was considered an endangered exotic wood, and in the 90s, actually, for a period of time, Buck actually stopped using ebony entirely. They started using a laminated material in place of ebony because ebony was under consumer protections in the US. They were not allowed to use it. In the early 2000s, Buck partnered with Taylor's Guitars. Taylor's Guitars, they make really, really nice guitars, but they actually have one of the most impressive conservation efforts in the world for ebony wood. And Buck partnered with them to get ebony, and now the Buck 110 is back to using ebony wood handles, along with the 112 Ranger. Both of these predate the ban on ebony wood. The 91 model predates it only by a very small amount. Obviously, the 70s version predates it by a good deal. Alright. Other than that, we have brass pins mostly. We have a steel pin to hold the back lock in place, which is interesting. I've speculated on it a few times, and I'm not entirely sure why they did that. I think it's just this is the piece that takes the most force in the knife. Other than the pivot, I don't know why the pivot isn't steel, but for whatever reason they did it that way. You have monoblock construction brass. So how they make this is they actually mill out the inside part, and then they slot the wood pieces in to the milled out section. These are not separate bolsters. They are actually part of a monoblock construction, which is kind of cool. Yeah, so Buck 110, not a small knife, over 4 inches. I'm gonna pull out my measurements. 3 1/4 inch blade. That's the number that they like to brag, and then like 4 3/4 inch handle. They're not small knives by any stretch of the imagination. They are big, chunky, very hand-filling. The older version is very, very square in its corners. The 90s version is much more rounded. You can actually even see how much more rounded the 90s version is. And modern knives are more similar to this with the heavy rounding. It's not an uncomfortable knife. It is very heavy, and it is very large. But both of these are actually quite comfortable to hold in the hand. And they are comfortable in a variety of positions. The one thing I will say for the older version is because of these, they're not sharp, but the less rounded over edges, they do dig a little bit into the palm of my hand in a reverse grip. But in most grips, saber, gorilla, you can even choke up like right behind the blade for fine woodworking and stuff like that. And it's a very comfortable knife to hold. The handle profile is slightly curved, but it's a very neutral ergonomic position. Which means, especially with the rounded over ones, even if your hands are quite small or very large, this is not a difficult knife to hold. However, it is unquestionably heavy. These knives weigh 7.2 ounces, which is not an insignificant amount of weight. That's almost half a pound each. And a large portion of that is just because of the massive chunks of brass used in these. And they're not narrow knives either, right? Like, there's a reason I use the Buck 110 on my channel as a size comparison knife for thickness, because this is one of the thicker knives that is still not an absolute pain in the ass to put in your pocket all the time. Yeah, so that's over half an inch thick, 597.5 thousandths. Or in, I don't care about fractions right now, about 15 1/4 millimeters. So it is a fairly thick knife. And for that, you are getting a decent amount of blade. Like I said, you know, you've got 3 3/4 inches of blade, a little bit less than that in terms of where the sharpened edge starts, but you do have quite a bit of knife here, and you have a nice little bit of belly. This is one of, in terms of the actual edge profile, this is probably one of, if not my favorite knives out there. The flat section near the heel is really, really nice for finer woodworking tasks, and the belly a little bit further out gives good slicing and cutting, especially like around bones, that kind of a thing. That being said, They are a bit of a bitch to clean because they are completely enclosed and there's no screws. Like, they are entirely pinned to construction, right? Which makes them a little bit of a pain, in my opinion, for hunting and that kind of thing. Gunk gets in there really easily. And despite the fact that brass is fairly good for not getting super, super gross, it's still a bit annoying, right? They are absolutely two-handed action. They use a nail nick. Some of the more modern versions of the Buck 110 with the slimmer scales and like the more premium, more modern materials especially, have have thumb studs that are fairly easy to use, and lots of people have gone out and modified their Buck 110s. And that is something that I think is always worth talking about when you talk about Buck 110s. There is a massive depth of modification for these guys because they have been around for so long. So many people have learned how to modify them, learn how to make them more or less ideal for different people and their situations. I am here just to talk about the basic Buck 110. And it is heavy. It has a very comfortable, very neutral handle, but it's a very large handle. And despite the fact that, yes, many of the people I know with smaller hands do not find this too uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that it is ideal for smaller hands. There are some grips that are more difficult to do on this knife because of its massive size and weight. That, coupled with the fact that it doesn't have a pocket clip and you are reliant on a belt sheath, or just dropping it into your pocket, which is what I do when I carry this. And I do carry these knives occasionally. Not very often, but occasionally. And it does find its way into the bottom of the pocket. It's not something you're going to forget down there because it is a large, heavy object, but it is kind of annoying for a EDC situation, right? In terms of blade steel, 420HC, it's not the most modern thing in the world. Buck does a phenomenal job with their 420HC, especially more recently, but it is not a very premium knife steel. It's not a very modern knife steel. It's good, but for the price, you can't expect more a lot of the time, and that starts getting us into one of the more touchy subjects with the Buck 110. Oh yeah, no jimping anywhere on the blade. No sharp edges, which is nice, but no jimping anywhere on the blade. One of the more touchy things with the Buck 110, these cost in Canada between about $85 and $100 most places. There's some places that are more. I haven't really found anywhere that's less, but it's typically between that like $85 and $100 price range. And there's a lot of competition in that space. It does put it into what I consider to be a budget knife, which means the Buck 110 is what I consider to be a budget knife, but there's a lot of competition in the budget knife space, and the Buck 110 doesn't do anything better than anything else in particular, in my opinion. For the same price as these, at Canadian Tire, I can get a, and this is without any shopping around, there's literally just a Canadian Tire, I can get a K-Bar Dozer, which has a pocket clip, is a backlock, with D2 steel and thumb studs, which all around is a, in my opinion, better knife. It's similarly sized, it does a phenomenal job, and that's where I feel like the Buck 110 starts to fall behind in terms of a carry option. There is so many more modern things, and so many, in my opinion, better things out there for the money. And you can't ask them to make it for lower because it is made in the US, Buck warranty is a great thing, yada yada. They make better US models, in my opinion, as well, but that's neither here nor there. Their warranty is really, really good. You can send it in for sharpening, and you can't ask them to make it for less because there are very expensive materials here, right? Like, for example, even just the brass in this is a chunky piece. The ebony wood is a exotic wood that does cost an amount of money as a result of that, right? 420HC is a cheaper blade steel, but their fit and finish is quite good. Buck does a good job with their knives. And there's lots of little hand-finished touches, hand sharpening, for example, the Buck factory. And you can't ask them to charge less for this, but it makes it difficult to justify the price point in many cases. They are very good. They are heirloom quality pieces. They will last clearly, they can last a very long time. But I do feel that generally speaking, you are better off for like 50% more, so like 150-ish Canadian dollars typically. You can start getting into the upgraded blade steel versions, the S45 VNs with the Bose Brothers heat treatments. If you go custom shop with it, which I think is almost double the price, you start getting in options like antler and nickel bolsters instead of brass, if that's your speed. there are better configurations for the money. The problem with the Buck 110 is that it exists in a very, very awkward state where you have high quality manufacturing with medium quality materials. And that is really unfortunate. That's what makes it very hard to justify, right? And because it is so traditional, the market that you are selling to is much smaller. The people who can realistically get away with a two-hand opening, two-hand operating knife on the daily, because this is also a very low backlog. It takes two hands to close the knife in addition to two hands to open it. And once you have it open, it's very, very good, but these are people who are not using their knives in working situations. They're just not. It makes a very shitty work knife because of the fact that it takes two hands to operate, because of the fact that it goes dull so quickly, because of the fact that you have to root around in your pocket. Especially with gloves on, that can be difficult to do. If you want to compare that to, even within Buck's own lineup, in my opinion, a much better knife for the money, this is actually cheaper, this is the 722. I can open this with no problem with gloves on, and I can close this with no problem with gloves on. I can pull it out of my pocket because it does sit a little bit above the pocket. This is an easy knife for me to manipulate, and it's awkward to do at this angle because I'm sitting at my desk, but I can fairly easily reverse flick it, right? And it gets me that same, it's shorter for sure, but it does get me that same blade profile with the flat and then the belly. So I do think that it exists in an awkward space for that. It's difficult to justify its price tag because of the materials being used, but it's also difficult to justify asking for lower because of the workmanship being done. And the market that they're selling to is pretty much exclusively people who love Buck, which is fine. That's a good market. And people who can get away with a folding knife of this type, which is people who are out camping, hiking, whatever. And as comfortable as this is, it cannot compete with a folder for comfort, or with a fixed blade for comfort. So I do think that the Buck 110 exists in an awkward space for that reason, unfortunately. Let's do some size comparisons real quick. I normally compare things against the Buck 110, but in this particular instance, we're going to compare it up against the other two comparison knives I like, the Civivi Chevalier and the Wee Knives Banter. The Buck 110 is what I consider to be on the absolute upper limit of a medium-sized knife. I consider anything bigger than this to be a large knife. In terms of weight and feel, the Buck 110 is absolutely a large knife, but for actual blade length, 3 3/4 inches, it's not small, but I would consider it to be kind of normal in that regard. We're also going to just put it up next to a Zippo, just kind of because. There it is, next to a Zippo, and closed next to a Zippo. As you can see, it's a good deal thicker than the Zippo is. Yeah, that's kind of all I have to say about it. It's a good knife. It is very well made. They will last an extended period of time. It has its flaws, especially compared to many modern knives. And Buck has done a good job of filling in the gaps with the Buck 110 with more modernized versions like the Pro and the Hunter that do good work. But for having said that, there is still a place for the classic Buck 110. It's a nice knife, but you have to really want it. You have to like this aesthetic. You have to like this feel. And you have to be okay with having a knife that is suboptimal at a lot of things and doesn't particularly excel at anything, unfortunately. So yeah, that's all I have to say about it. I love this knife. It's just, if you're being objective about it, it's a hard knife to justify in today's landscape. Stay safe and have fun out there. Peace.